Good morning, everyone. There's still a few people coming in, which is great. Could I encourage people to fill up the front a little bit so we don't feel so lonely down at this end of the hall? That would be wonderful. Because we want to feel like we're having a conversation with you. Thank you very much. I'm going to make a start and offer some introductory remarks while you're all just getting seated. This is a session really to take forward some of the high-level conversations that we had and drill down into some specific examples from different countries, different case studies, and different models. And my name is Kirk, and I'm CEO of GEMS Education Solutions, which is the part of GEMS that works on strategic conversations with government in order to try and provide some imaginative solutions to the challenges we're facing. And we're very lucky to have with us a distinguished panel from a wide variety of backgrounds and regions as well. So first of all, on my left, we have Lord Andrew Adonis. Andrew, as many of you will know, was a key architect of the education revolution that happened under Tony Blair in the UK from 1997, and in particular introduced many reforms into the English system, which really changed the nature of how education was supplied. And we also have Dave Bloomgarden, and sorry, I'm following the speaker order here rather than the seating order. We have Dave Bloomgarden. David is a real specialist on public-private partnerships and works within the Inter-American Development Bank and therefore focuses particularly on the reforms in Latin America. We have Patrick Dlamini, who is CEO and Managing Director of the Development Bank in South Africa. So we'll get some rich input from that continent and that country. And finally, on my left, we have Dr. Abdullatif, the CEO of Tatweer Holding Company in Saudi Arabia. And Tatweer is a key part of the reforms being put in place in Saudi Arabia in order to seek to improve the quality of education available to Saudis and allow a more responsive system for the student. So perhaps I could start, Andrew, by asking you, just to help us understand from your experience as a minister driving through reforms like this, and what you've learned since talking to governments, what are some of the kind of key elements that need to be borne in mind when we're making these reforms?
Thank you very much, Chris. I should say I've very rarely felt so isolated from my audience. If this were a class, I would now go into the middle and speak right down there, but I hope you can hear us okay and relate to us. Public-private partnerships, which is what we're talking about in terms of generating better quantity and quality in education, are like the rainbow. They come in a whole range of different colours, and there's no one single concept of a public-private partnership in education. But if I can just offer some introductory remarks from my experience, there are four key areas of public-private partnership, and I want to say a word about them in turn. There's the supply of infrastructure, there's the supply of services, there's the supply of management, and there's the supply of whole schools. And I then also want to say something about what we mean by the private sector and public-private partnership, because we're often talking about very different concepts in terms of private sector engagement. Perhaps if I could just take those in turn and say just a brief word about them, because I only have 5 minutes. Firstly, infrastructure. Traditionally, the state supplied infrastructure in developed countries for schools. In the United Kingdom, local authorities were responsible for procuring schools directly. This was found to be relatively inefficient, but also poor in terms of design and maintenance. And a big feature of the supply of new school buildings over the last 20 years has been to move on a much more defined contractual relationship with private construction companies. At its most extreme form, this has taken the form of what we've called in Britain PFI, a private finance initiative, whereby the construction companies not only are responsible for building the schools, but also for maintaining them on contracts for 25 to 30 years with defined service levels and requirements to maintain those services. And this has had a mixed experience. The plus has been greater attention to whole life design of schools, which has been a big problem in school construction historically, that schools have been constructed in volume by local authorities to meet immediate needs, and then in many cases they've been poorly constructed and have started to show serious deterioration quite quickly. And secondly, this enables higher quality services to be provided during the life of the school building. And to some extent it's achieved these goals. However, one part of the experience I should share with you is that the bureaucracy has been very significant, and seeking to define long-term service contracts for the maintenance of schools is a complicated business, and some of these contracts have been literally feet high and have been very constraining for school managers in terms of maintaining their buildings. But a much better defined relationship with private sector contractors is going to be a big part of future school supply. Secondly, services. Schools, of course, have always bought significant services in the private sector, textbooks, equipment, and so on. This is now tending to be more formalised. IT is a big part of this conference, and the use of IT systems to roll out education. Most of our schools in England have IT contracts with major IT suppliers, not only to supply the hardware, but also to service their IT as well. And this is increasingly spreading throughout the area. Sometimes the engagement of teachers, which is also done in some cases by contract. Learning programs, increasingly the private sector is engaged in supplying learning contracts as well. Thirdly, management. Companies now are increasingly, the private sector increasingly engaged in supplying management to schools and to local authorities. And in Britain over the last 10 years, we have particularly focused private sector management on underperforming local authorities and underperforming schools, essentially offering contracts to private operators set against defined standards objectives to supply management to schools. And again, that's been an expanding area of activity and has involved new forms of partnership. Fourthly, whole school management. The single biggest reform we've carried through in public education in England over the last 10 years is the creation of what we've called academy schools. And academy schools are schools which are entirely franchised out to non-state operators who take responsibility for the construction, for the design, for the management, for the curriculum, for the standards, similar to charter schools in the United States on a contract with the state. The contract with the state specifies certain key requirements, that the schools must be free, they must be all ability, they must have a local catchment, features of this kind. But this is revolutionary in English terms because historically the schools were set up and managed by the local authorities. And this has been steadily expanding, and now a significant proportion of schools in England are managed by the private sector. Growing out, the last session with the ministers emphasised the importance of church schools in many developing countries. Well, of course, church schools and faith-based organisations have always been strongly engaged in education in developed countries too. And in the United Kingdom, we've historically had a very strong church school sector, which has been semi-autonomous within the state sector. This has been expanded, and the principles which have led to the churches establishing schools over the last centuries have now been extended to allow not-for-profit organisations of a wide variety to establish them. A final word about what we mean by the private sector. In England, and in most of the countries that we're talking about, we mean three different things by the private sector. We mean not-for-profit trusts, but which are separate from the government, which in England we refer to as private, even though they don't generate profits. They are the major supplier of new schools. In England, and indeed in most developed countries, there is either an outright or a substantial prohibition on profit-making companies directly managing schools. However, not-for-profits can manage them. So in England, the academies I talked about can be wholly managed and franchised out to not-for-profit private operators, but not for organisations which run for profit. The second group we talk about in England are existing private schools. Now, existing private schools in England are mostly charities for historical reasons. In most other countries, they're not charities and they're profitable organisations which run for profit, like GEMS, which manages schools. And of course, this has the double advantage of bringing existing experienced school operators into supplying partnership services, as well as, of course, bringing the wider private sector to bear. And then the third area is, of course, for-profit companies, both those which are directly engaged in education and increasingly service companies, which offer a large range of business and other services, but are developing education as part of their portfolio. In England, they've been particularly important in providing back office type services for local authorities, local education authorities, those administering the education system, and for schools, where often this has been part of contracts to supply a wider range of services. So just to sum up, in my country and in most developed countries, the private sector a generation ago played some role in supplying individual services to schools, but almost no role in the management of education and the direct supply of schools themselves. That has radically changed. The private sector is now a substantial provider of management services in the education system, and now increasingly a supplier of whole schools. However, there is still a big debate in my country and many developed countries about the role of for-profit private sector, the for-profit private sector as against the not-for-profit private sector. And the two are often conflated in discussion, but are very distinct. And the charitable not-for-profit sector is the sector which has grown fastest and now plays the biggest role in our system.
Thank you, Andrew. And I think what I've heard is the story of a journey of a government realizing that in order to improve things, in some ways it had to let go and remove some of the well-intentioned but cumbersome bureaucracy that governments unfortunately will tend to spring up through the best of intentions. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Abdullatif, and I suppose ask you the question, is it fair to say that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is commencing on this journey? And if that is true, what are your hopes and fears for that journey?
Well, to start with, I just would like to give you an idea about the landscape of the education and the challenges and why the Tatweer Education Holding Company came into place. Saudi Arabia has witnessed a very fast growth in population and an expansion of schools, and that means also the expansion of all of the bureaucracy that surrounds the school. And we have already about 700,000 employees in the Ministry of Education. We have 5.5 million students. We have over 30,000 schools and 550,000 teachers. The ministry would supply the schools themselves, meaning building the infrastructure, transport the students, run the school canteens, and even school health, and operate the schools. The government had to take a step back and realize that this is just getting too complicated, and that the real focus on the school was being lost. And so the Ministry of Education came up with a vision of focusing on the learner and creating a total system around that. One of their first decisions is to create this innovative instrument of change called Tatweer Education Holding Company. And the Tatweer Education Holding Company is meant to take over most of the support services that are now provided by the Ministry of Education, to reduce bureaucracy, as been mentioned now, and to enhance this public partnership or public PPP partnerships. Now, one of the company's examples of the things that we are doing is we have created a company called the Tatweer Building Company. Now, the Tatweer Building Company will take over the management and the maintenance of the buildings of the Ministry of Education, the schools. Well, that will create avenues because of cooperating with the private sector in terms of the partnerships that will take over the buildings and the maintenance and the financing of the large number of schools that are needed. So this is one of an innovative approach. One thing to mention is that Tatweer, or THC, is a for-profit company. So it has to abide by all of the rules and the constraints of working in the private sector and for-profit. It's an innovative instrument by the Saudi government. It has a board. The board is composed of members of leading personalities from the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Education, and the private sector. Now, this company is tasked with the implementation of King Abdullah project. King Abdullah project is a project to focus on training of teachers, revamping the curriculum, developing new content and training the school leaders. For this, we've also created another subsidiary called Tatweer Educational Services Company. This company now has taken over and is implementing King Abdullah project. We've also created another company called Tatweer Transportation Company, School Transportation Company. Now, the ministry is already transporting about 630,000 students to schools. We're planning to double that and triple that over the coming 5 years. Now, what we have done with this company, which has its own independent board of managers, is to work with the private sector, the providers, in two ways. We work with the large operators, agreeing with them on KPIs, on qualities. We monitor, we do all of that. And we are now starting also activities to focus on the small and medium enterprises that are providing the transportation for students in the countryside. We've already seen changes in the dynamics of the market, and new entrants are now coming into the market, and companies are consolidating and trying to enter, seeing the serious efforts that are taking place with this respect. Another objective of THC is actually to localize the know-how. Saudi Arabia has been spending a lot of money on many projects in education, but these are projects that are done by our foreign or international partners. They deliver a product and go. What we want to do is to build entities that are going to deliver services for the government in partnership with the international and local providers, but in the process, we want to build the know-how, localize it through agreements that cater for the transfer of know-how. We embed our teams with the international teams that work for us, and we also think and work seriously around joint ventures around certain initiatives and products that will also, create, joint take for both sides, a win-win situations for those people that are joining us. We are trying to develop or working to develop this educational ecosystem in Saudi Arabia to provide quality jobs for the young people that are now, up and coming. And as you know, we have over 160,000 students studying all over the world. They are coming with a lot of skills, and we need to create the entities that can absorb them. In a nutshell, this is a very innovative approach. It's an approach for some symbiotic relationships to develop between the government and the private sector, and to leave lasting economic effects on Saudi society, and in the process also reform education and focus on the student. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've heard about some fairly dramatic changes being created, and one is always aware that education is often a very political as well as a social form of activity. And whenever we talk about making changes, we can't ignore the political dimension. And David, what I would like to understand is, given that in South America, within Chile, you've had a voucher system going back to the 1980s. one might imagine that reform and adoption of public-private ways of working might be, really quite acceptable. But I would really like to understand, from your point of view, what are the key initiatives in play in Latin America, and what are the things that you're seeing having the most success?
Okay, thank you. I'm glad that you raised first the issue of Chile, because that is a very interesting case study because of their extensive experience with vouchers. As some of you may know, or may not know, depending on your familiarity with the region, in Chile last year there were widespread student riots against the voucher system. So one could then say, apparently this is not a good system. However, what's interesting is if you look at the statistics, Chile, by all the OECD measures, is probably the best education system, bar none, in all of Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of their results. Yet, the students are protesting. So the question would be, what's going wrong in that voucher system? And I think what you see in Chile is, at the top, you have purely private schools that can compete with any school in the world, very good schools. At a middle level, you have partially subsidized voucher schools. Well, the vouchers don't cover the entire cost of the schools, but the schools are pretty good. They tend to get middle and upper middle income children that go to it. And then towards the bottom of the income ladder, you have fully subsidized voucher schools and public schools. They still have public schools. And both of those, the public schools being at the very bottom, have performance issues. And the voucher schools have not only the performance issue, but they're costly. So for the lower income students, they're facing this burden of still paying for school, the better schools, even though they get a voucher. So I think it comes down to an issue of affordability. Yet, if you look at the results, they actually are the best performing in all of Latin America and the Caribbean, which does make an argument in favor of the vouchers, but I think they have to look at social equity in terms of how they apply the vouchers. And I think in general in Latin America, education is still very much a public sector issue. There's very entrenched interests. I think it will continue to be largely publicly delivered. The private sector initiatives that we see are largely in the form of smaller pilots, voucher programs, contract models where the school is subsidizing a place in a private school. Perhaps maybe one example that I know of a PFI model, very much modeled on the UK for one university in Mexico, which actually won a 2012 World Finance Award for one of the best PFI deals in the world. So it's working in terms of the building of the infrastructure very well. I haven't seen studies on the academic performance of this particular university in Mexico, although my understanding is it's one of the better universities. But I think we need to look at that, which leads to another issue. There's very little in the way of randomized scientific data on performance of vouchers, contract schools versus public schools. However, what studies are done, there's a clear trend that they do perform better, that retention rates are better, that graduation rates are better. Although as a development person, we would prefer to see the gold standards of evaluations to really measure how they do better. But in general, I think we can see that the models that are there, though they're in the minority, do perform better than the public school system.
Okay, thank you, David. And I think, that really starkly brings out just how important this is to people and the sort of tensions and feelings that can run when one is thinking about reform in education. And Patrick, I would be interested to know, from the point of view of a development bank, if you like, an impact investor, you are presumably looking to try and stimulate change, to address issues of youth unemployment, to improve educational quality. What are the kind of key measures that you're looking for in terms of the things that you look to support, and how do you know that they really make a difference?
Thank you very much, Chris. Actually, this conference is very critical, and I think it's something that ought to be supported. the world over, given that it is beginning to get us to talk about what is of fundamental importance to any human being. Let me start off by this formula that I always actually discuss with people in my life, that human capital is a function of well-educated, well-trained boys from all walks of life in any particular nation, plus, and I emphasize, plus, well-educated, well-trained girls from all walks of life in any nation. If you want to optimize that equation, there is no other way that you can ever get it right for the greater good of that nation. Whatever we're trying to do in our respective countries and in the globe, we ought to understand that for the optimum utilization of the brains that have been given by God to any particular nation, it is a system that is inclusive. Inclusive in terms of kids coming from rich backgrounds, inclusive in terms of kids coming from impoverished and poor backgrounds. Unless we begin to deal with those fundamental basics, we are not going to get anywhere. The world would never be a better place unless those fundamentals are in place. As a development financial institutions, we do not believe that there shall ever be any sustainable and effective development unless that development is built on the basis of well-equipped people, well-equipped leaders that are going to look after in a very responsible way that economy as it grows. In sub-Saharan Africa, from 1994 to 2011, 1994, the combined GDP of sub-Saharan Africa, it was sitting at about $500 billion US. And the vast nations within sub-Saharan Africa were almost like a basket case, dependent largely on donation from developed countries. Come 2011, that's why I was so encouraged when I saw His Excellency President Obasanjo talking there, because he's one of the collective leadership that said, depending on donation from developed countries is not going to take Africa anywhere. And hence we saw a lot of political reform and courageous political leadership taking place in the continent. But at 2011, as of 2011, the combined GDP of sub-Saharan Africa was sitting at something between 1.8 billion, 1.8 trillion rather, from 500 billion in 1994 to 1.8 trillion, almost 3 times. And in 2017, it is forecast that it will be sitting at no less than 2.6 trillion US dollars. The question is, by 2030, sub-Saharan Africa will have the youngest and the biggest global workforce. The question becomes, with this such economic growth trajectory, how does it become sustainable and effective if it is not embedded on well-trained and well-educated young men and women in the continent? We always talk about the Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance. Pan-Africanism can only thrive and prosper if people are well educated to understand that I might be different from you, but you're equally important in my life. God made us social animals. We cannot survive without each other. And African Renaissance, we can see it has taken its shape. We can see that actually the time has come for the continent. But the biggest problem is in 2050, it is forecast that sub-Saharan Africa will have no less than 1,000 brand new cities. I'm not talking about towns. I'm talking about cities. You go to Luanda, just outside Luanda in Angola, you will see 500,000 homes that have been built. You're looking at a population of almost 1.5 to 2 million people. You go to Tet in Mozambique, you will see something mind-boggling. In South Africa, in the Karoo, something actually that will be in the region of 4 million people actually within the Karoo region is coming up because of the potential of shale gas. Brand new cities that have never been seen anywhere else. I can actually go on and on. Yesterday we had President Bill Clinton talk about, in the next 10 years, in the top 10 best performing economies, 7 of them will be coming from sub-Saharan Africa. And again, it continuously says, with the lack of education, with the lack of quality education and access to quality education from the rural and the poor communities in the continent, how are we going to make sure that this becomes sustainable? Governments alone can never achieve that. It will take private sector involvement and civil society involvement in driving a profound and meaningful change for the continent to be able actually to see its true potential. But the question is, with the global shortage of qualified teachers, yes, we may talk about education, but I want to emphasize the quality of education that we're talking about. I want to emphasize about the science subjects. I'm talking about science and maths that are being taught in these schools. Because when you drill down to that level, that's where it becomes increasingly alarming that we're not getting people with the right kind of education to drive our economy. When you talk of knowledge economy, it can only be based on quality and science subject being very, very critical and heavily promoted among all our citizenship. And therefore, as a developing financial institution, it's very important that we begin to start to say, how can we be a catalyst for PPPs in our respective countries? How can we help governments and our nations to leverage on technology? We don't have to have all bricks and mortars all over the place. Now we need to start saying e-learning. I call this thing e-revolution, electronic revolution. Because now it is beginning to say we can begin to offer top-notch quality education for a child in the poorest of the poor through technology. But now we need to capacitate governments and ministries of education to be able actually to again modernize themselves. A lot has changed, but education and how we're imparting knowledge to our children, in as much as they've proven to us so many times that they have become so technologically savvy, we have not actually adapted fast enough. But now we want to say, let us build more schools. Let us look at how we can bridge the shortage of quality teachers to teach quality subjects to our schools all over the world. That's what we want to make sure that we become part of. That's what we want to make sure that we're able to help our respective governments on the continent to be able to do justice in the development of the continent.
Thank you very much, Patrick. What came through to me really clearly was, first of all, that it's essential that we get those basics right, because too many people will miss out. And finding a way to do that is sustainable. And the final point, that it's the quality of the teacher that will make that sustainability. So I have one more question of my own for the panel, and then I'm going to turn to all of you to ask some questions. So this is a bit of advance notice to be thinking about what it is that you'd like to take this opportunity to find out about. And my question is for Dr. Abdullatif, which is, given what we've heard about the importance of teacher quality, and given that Tatweer is going to become involved in that area of teacher quality and teacher training, what are the things that you think are relevant in terms of learning from the private sector, but also learning from best practice in different parts of the world as you go about creating that teacher training program?
From the start, you know, the company, as it designed the teacher training programs, is consciously bringing international expertise in the picture. So we work with leading companies. You know, we've worked with Pearson, we've worked with McGraw-Hill in development of the curriculum, and also in the design of the training programs. We've started, you know, we have many challenges when it comes to the teacher education. First, I think there was a bit of a disconnect between the product from the universities and the needs of the schools. There was a sort of a, you know, a distance between the two, where the Ministry of Education was really developing at a faster rate at what the universities are, you know, willing to go. So we tried to work on our own to bridge that gap. We started a program called the New Teacher Induction Program. We worked with the CFPT from the UK, and we worked with a company from Egypt, and also providers from Saudi Arabia to design those programs. We designed them, and also we trained the trainers. We have a train the trainer program where those trainers will do the training in their own schools. We're also now working with you know, some international companies to design program for teachers for science and math training for teachers, also using the same model, and training the trainers so we have that supply within our own communities. So to conclude here, we're not only depending on our own national experience, we're consciously seeking the international input. The challenge is, how do we make those skills of developing training programs, managing training programs, continuing to give those training programs, be localized and indigenized, so we can also improve and revise and continue in this continuous development of teachers.
Thank you. So let me turn to people out there. We've got a question down at the front from Margaret. There's a microphone coming.
Well, excellent input, and congratulations for organising this conference, Chris. It's great. My name is Margaret McCabe. I'm a barrister from the UK by profession, but I now set up and I run an organisation called DebateMate. Very quickly, I just want to give you an example of what DebateMate does in the private partnership field, to show you an example of how cost-effective and how innovative it can be. Basically, what we do is we have adopted an old-fashioned English model of British parliamentary debating, and we've turned it into a highly innovative way of teaching 21st century skills. Lord Adonis, in his recent book, said that DebateMate skills should be at the center of all modern education. And that is our mission, to place these skills right at the heart of education where they should be. There's a lot of talk today about vocational skills, apprenticeships, professional skills, skilling up young people to participate in the global economy. But without the 21st century skills at the very heart of that, the young people won't actually function as employable citizens. For those of you who aren't conversant with 21st century skills, they are the key skills of critical thinking, communication skills. Communication skills include both listening and speaking, and we know for a fact that listening is probably one of the most important skills that young people can learn. And you combine those with strategic teamwork and leadership skills, and you have an employable citizen who can function fully in their own economy and in the economy in the global economy. The reason that our program is really successful is because it's incredibly cost effective. It's unique. We use the internet as much as we can, and we've mobilized an army of one of the best resources available to education that I don't think anybody else has discovered yet, and that is a body of undergraduate university students. We bolt on to existing education programs, so we don't need expensive school structures, we don't need buildings. We just mobilize this army and they come and teach this program. We produce our own resources, and our results are absolutely staggering. I want to give you an example of the work that we do, for example, in Zambia. The Zambian government has just come to us. It's being financed by Standard Chartered, the bank, and they're asking us to rewrite their education curriculum to include these skills so that Zambia can produce the human capital it needs to run its country effectively. This work we're also being asked to do this work by the Colombian government, by the Israeli government, by joint venture with Pearson's in China, and it's improving the hard and soft skills of the students in the population. Just to give you an idea of the scale of what we're doing, we access university undergraduate debaters, and for those of you here who don't understand what that involves, at university level across the US, the UK, most of the African continent, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, there is a heaving industry of university students who debate regularly at school, at university, and they compete every year in a world championship, university championship, but it's held in one country around the world. And there's a database of 10,000 students, and they're our mentors, and we can mobilize them very quickly through the internet to teach our programs anywhere around the world. So we're very happy to talk to anyone further who's interested in this. And just to give you, Bill Clinton was explaining how wonderful Teach for America is. We partner with organizations like Teach First in the UK, we partner with Teach for America in the US, and we're talking to Teach for Israel, we're partnering with Teach for Australia in Australia, and Teach for India in India. So we are a very simple, very straightforward bolt-on organization. I have two of my staff here today if anyone wants to discuss this further. We also offer a teacher training program. Sorry, Chris, thanks very much. It's a bit of an ad.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. That was obviously a barrister's version of a question, which I've learned something. never ask a barrister a question. Okay, could we have some questions from the audience, please?
I'm Dr. R.K. Rai. I'm basically a neurologist, a doctor from India. What we have noticed during our research project, that the greatest problem that the schools in India and other countries also are facing is a deficit of attention of students during the school period. The second problem that is plaguing almost all American schools and Indian schools is development of destructive tendencies among the students. Now, as the honorable speaker right said, as a neurologist, we are hardly utilizing our 10% of brain. And the humankind, if we want to march ahead, we have to utilize to the maximum level of the functioning of the brain. Now, we have taken up 250 schools in India. As you know, India consists of many states. It's a multilingual country, a very diversified country. We took schools from rich strata right to poor strata. Gentlemen, you will be surprised and amazed to know that the problem plaguing the students from rich strata and poor strata are the same. Result there being that the children who have not been trained in the house or who are unleft, there are many reasons, I don't want to go in that, but they are becoming problem to the teachers. So our institution, the Center for Training in Primary Leadership, we don't only teach the teachers, we train the teachers how to correctly handle the students, how to motivate them. Also, we train the industry's leaders. As the honorable speaker rightly said, if the humanity has to go upward, we have to take everyone into account, and we have to see and ensure that the entire human mass, the entire community, educated community, has to be geared to the highest human values. That is the ultimate of all education, as one of the Indian rishis says, you know, the whole purpose, as Vivekananda said in America, in Chicago, the whole purpose of education was one, to remove the darkness from the mind of the people itself. And there comes the role of our institution. We are ready to help anybody, any country, any organization to get the maximum out of our students.
And do you have a question for the...
I have a question. I have a question.
I'm obviously not very good at this, and I do apologize for
I have a question. I have a question. How can we see the best brain all over the world, as I know?
Yeah.
I'm a doctor. Joins the medicine, engineering, law, and the last stream comes to teaching. This is my country. I don't know what is happening in your country. Sir,
Okay.
can any of suggest how to bring the best of the brain in teaching?
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to collect a few questions. So we have a question. Let's collect a few more. Some tables around the middle here. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Can I ask?
Thank you.
I wrote my question down, so
Excellent.
I'm just going to read it. David Bloomgarden, you mentioned a call for evaluation because there's only really pockets of research that are random in this new collaborative sector. And I've kind of got a question about, given the drive and the concerns regarding these partnerships, and that there's no successful corporate that doesn't systematize results-based management to ensure profitability, measuring inputs, operational efficiency, and outcomes. Why is it that monitoring and evaluation doesn't seem to be anywhere in the landscape when you have the public and the private partnering to ensure a basic standard of education while looking at targets to embed this in the collaborative sector?
Okay, thank you
That's it.
very much. I'll collect a few more. We've got one there. Margaret. Another Margaret.
This is really to Lord Adonis. Why do you think there is such fierce opposition to direct engagement by private for-profit organisations, and will it diminish?
Okay, thank you, Margaret. Other questions? Yes, this lady here. Thank you.
Okay, my question is similar to that, to Lord Adonis. Do you think that there can be sufficient quantity of independent state-financed schools without letting for-profit providers to propose and run whole schools in the UK?
Okay, thank you.
My question is for guy from Saudi Arabia. How do they guarantee that the company Tatweer does their best job at the schools rather than giving an inferior quality building and food and whatever, all of the maintenance? Because I've seen that happening with other governments.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one more question and then we will attempt to work through those. One more question? Yes, down here. I'm just checking I'm not missing people at the back. I don't think so. Thank you.
Thank you. Charlie Duff, Oricon Group. I wonder whether I could extend the private sector question to Patrick Dlamini and ask him what his view is on the role of the for-profit sector in education in Africa as Africa develops going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we've got sort of one group of questions which is really around what more governments may need to do in terms of that spectrum of involvement from public to private, and whether we're reaching a tipping point where we can only achieve the step change through the involvement of fully private. And an answer from Andrew and from Patrick on that question would be very useful. Thank you.
Could I take up 2 points? Firstly, the really excellent presentation by Margaret on DebateMate, which is doing fantastic work in the United Kingdom and internationally, exhibits one important role that the private sector plays, which is of course, innovation. What we need constantly is to innovate in our systems and to harness new ways of delivering learning, raising standards, and inspiring students, and harnessing new forms of energy in the education system. And DebateMate is a classic example of that. We have this huge body of university debaters, most of whom in our country went to very elite schools, which teach debating, and it's always been part of their curriculum, but don't make any wider contribution to the education system at all. And what DebateMate does is it systematically harnesses them. It trains them. It then places them in groups of 2 or 3 in schools which do not have debating as a part of the curriculum. For them, this of course is an immensely fruitful learning experience, but it's transformational for the students. And it particularly targets schools in more deprived areas where these communication skills, presentation skills, need to become a part of the curriculum and historically have not been. And precisely this model, what I found so interesting is that Margaret elided between what she's doing in the United Kingdom and what's happening in developing countries. And of course, in many parts of the more deprived communities of the United Kingdom, the challenge is quite similar. It is to reinvent and radically extend the concept of education. Now, when it comes then to the questions about the for-profit sector and the other private sector, what we need to do, of course, is to harness the energies of all of the parts of the private sector in education. In the developed world, the not-for-profit private sector, though, is historically strong and has a great deal to offer. The churches, religious organisations, existing educational organisations which are not part of the state, these are huge resources. And in developing the academy programme running privately managed schools, I found that they have an enormous amount to give. You get into a very different and much more difficult political argument when you start engaging with the for-profit sector, because then you get into an argument not about the capacity of organisations like DebateMate, which harness voluntary effort and charitable effort and what contribution they can make to the education system. You get into an argument then about profit-making companies and whether the profits are going to be taken out of the state education system, which is, most people regard, even though, of course, compared to developing countries, it's well-funded, most people regard it as seriously underfunded. And Tony Blair, who I know spoke 2 days ago, he had a great motto, which is what matters is what works. And what I've always said to for-profit companies, including GEMS, is you need to be able to demonstrate, and you need to be able to demonstrate powerfully with evaluation, that the contribution you're making is greater than the contribution which the state is able to make without you. And if you can demonstrate that, then you can make a practical and pragmatic argument for private sector engagement. If you can't demonstrate it, then of course you come back to the fundamental question of whether or not profit should be taken out of the existing system.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Patrick, what's your take on that question?
In South Africa, we have had a very exciting or interesting development around the involvement of private sector in education. Predominantly in South Africa, public education is provided by government, almost 99% of it, especially I'm talking about tertiary education. But if we were to look at primary and secondary education, in the past 18 years, we've seen an unprecedented levels of private schooling systems actually mushrooming all over the country. There's one school actually that we funded last year. They had about 5,000 student enrollment. This year they're sitting at about 15,000 enrollment. And the biggest challenge for the government has been around the social delivery challenges that is also facing. And people looking at what is happening outside and then having these private schooling systems coming up and poaching the best of brains from the public schooling system. And now the government is left with very poor quality teaching or very inexperienced teachers, because now the private sector has taken the cream, de la cream, if I may use the word, to the private sector. And now the question then becomes, how do you balance that? Because now it says the well-off will continue to be much more lucky, and the poorer will continue to be destitute. And the question has been, how then do you stem that tide in such a way that actually you bring in private sector that will also ensure that there is quality training for teachers, that they can develop their own teachers without necessarily poaching the top teachers from the public schooling system, and making sure that actually that the basics actually do exist in both sectors. But private sector has a very critical role to play in balancing the quality of education actually in the country. And I do believe that PPPs for the continent, the time actually has come for them to be much more effective.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So, David, if you could pick that up, it sounds like one of the ways to address this concern that the private sector may either attract the best teaching staff and therefore leave the public sector without, or be over-incentivized, could be around the PPPs, the kind of work that you're looking at with vouchers. If you've got any thoughts on that, and also picking up this important point that so much of the debate hinges on opinion and people's beliefs, and yet actually there ought to be a wealth of evidence out there, and if we were talking about the best treatment for cancer or the best way to deal with many other issues, there'd be a whole wealth of detailed evaluation evidence that would be before us. Are we doing enough to monitor and evaluate the kind of initiatives that are going on?
One thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is precisely that. In the program I actually work for is an innovation fund. It's part of the Inter-American Development Bank. It's called the Multilateral Investment Fund. And it's precisely set up to do small pilots with the private sector. Private sector broadly defined to mean companies, NGOs, foundations, civil society, community groups. We're required with every project to set aside 5% for impact evaluation, monitoring, setting up baselines. And the idea of our projects is not just to do a one-off project, but to learn from it and then to have an active dissemination program of results. And we work in three broad areas besides education. We do inclusive finance, we do access to markets for the poor, and basic services. And within basic services, one of the core things for us is education. So I think the way to address what you're saying is to start small, do pilots, measure, monitor, and disseminate, and share that in forums like this, web-based forums as well, and that's how you get around that. And then as to the point, are we draining, when we promote private sector participation, do we drain the public sector? And I think that's really the wrong way to look at it. I'm not denying that people go from the public to the private, sometimes for a better salary. We all know that happens in our countries and in the countries that we work. But what we're really trying to do is identify where the gaps are. We're not trying to replace a public sector. We're trying to complement the role of the public sector, to go where the public sector is not providing a service. For example, in Latin America, only half the kids complete secondary school. Yet big companies and medium-sized companies can't get the skills to grow and compete because they're not available in the job market. So you have this paradox. And I've heard other people refer to the paradox in Africa, in Asia, even in middle-income Latin America, even in the United States, we have that paradox. So the role of the private sector should be to complement and help public policy meet its objectives, not to replace.
Thank you, David. So the last point falls to you, Dr. Abdullatif. And you've been asked a question around how you can ensure that Tatweer is offering the very best services to the teachers and students that receive it. But I think earlier on we were also left hanging with an even more profound question, which is how do we know that we'll be able to create an education system that makes the very best of the human brain, of the potential that's inside every student going through the system. So just in a minute or two, if you could give us your thoughts on your hopes for that in terms of Saudi Arabia.
Okay. One important point to mention is that the reform of education in Saudi Arabia now is really a systemic approach. It's touching all aspects of the system, not just Tatweer education, taking one aspect and everything is left alone. One of the recent decisions by the Saudi government is to form a regulatory or a monitoring authority to monitor the performance of the schools and the ministry and the services of Tatweer and all of that. And it is independent of the ministry. It reports to the king directly. This will actually put a lot of pressure even on the Ministry of Education in its running of its schools, whether it is delivering value or not. And it will not be evaluating itself, it will be an independent evaluator. Another layer is that we have built specialized companies where, Tatweer Education Holding Company is not going to be another Ministry of Education where it's doing everything under one roof. That's why we chose this specialization of subsidiaries with their own independent boards of managers and governance and governing system to manage them. The other thing is that we are dealing with a client-supplier relationship with the ministry. So the ministry actually works with us on setting the standards and monitors whether we are delivering services for them or not. Now, saying all of that, THC is a new experience, a new experiment. It's innovative. You know, the jury is still out whether this is really going to be a very successful experience or it's going to pass by difficulties on its way to success. What I have seen so far is that we have made a difference. We've made a difference in the transportation and in the consolidation of that industry and creating new providers. We have made a difference, let's say, in providing the nutrition in the schools and introduced new ways and methods of delivering it to the schools. I've been to the schools myself and we do the monitoring. We have even WhatsApp groups to monitor our experiment in the schools that we have started with, to see what's going on and respond to complaints quickly. THC, as I said, is new. We need to monitor. We have created at the holding company level also a monitoring and measurement and assessment and monitoring function to monitor the impact of our interventions, independent of our subsidiaries. So, you know, the system is complete. It has the necessary checks and balances, but we will see, and we will learn from this experience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're going to bring this to a close now. Personally, I found the contributions from the panelists very enlightening, and to hear about the different experiences from different countries at so many different stages in their journeys towards creating the excellent education systems they want. And whilst they are all different, I think there are a few common threads, which for me came out as, firstly, this point of the importance of an independent inspectorate, separate from the government, separate from the Ministry of Education, able to comment objectively on the quality of what is happening. Secondly, we've heard a lot about the importance of incentives so that institutions and governments can share practice, can learn nationally and across the world, and that is helped if there are a variety of different providers, not only government, but private and not-for-profit sectors as well, sharing that practice, because then we'll get that stimulation and that innovation. And that should lead to more choice, more quality for students, and very importantly also for teachers in terms of their chosen profession. And I'm left hopeful that there's a lot of components there that can be put together to really create a way of having better education, fit for the 21st century with all the skills students need, and that will drive us forward to a more prosperous economy and society. So thank you very much for taking part. Thank you. And let me close by thanking all of the panelists for their excellent contributions.